Hello, my name is Iles, and in today's episode we're looking at the question, who were the Border Reivers? Welcome back. We're going to be talking about the people of the English-Scottish borders in the medieval period and how the population survived this bloody and difficult age. In a previous series, I looked at how the Anglo-Scottish borders were formed, politically, from the point of view of the northeast of England, and the effect after the Normans invaded, with William the Conqueror, his descendants, and the Plantagenets battling with the people of England, Scotland, and the surrounding nations. Now we're going to look right at the people who lived on the border between England and Scotland and discover how they survived when everything exploded into warfare. So who were the Border Reivers? The Reivers evolved out of the populations who lived in the harsher areas of Northumberland, Cumbria, the Scottish borders and Dumfries and Galloway after the Norman conquest. The lands that they lived in were harsh. In the west, salt marsh. Then, in the central region, the hills rose up towards the Cheviots and then dropped down into the fertile land of the Scottish borders. And then in the east were the fertile Tweed and coastal areas. The main area of the Reivers, though, was the Liberty of Tynedale and Redesdale, an area which would eventually be known by its own name, the Debatable land, with neither England or Scotland wanting it. Some see the Reivers as a pure line of culture from the Anglo-Saxon Northumbrians who had lived in the region prior to the conquest, continuing the lifestyle that they had been used to from before the conquest period, while others connect them back to the Celtic cattle raiding, hill-fort warfare and the pre-Roman peoples of the British Isles. Both of these views are incredibly romantic, and they don't actually reflect what was happening to the peoples in this area. The truth is that people on both sides of the border were connected culturally, and it's well known that in regions with borders there is always a melting pot, as you often have more in common with the person on the other side of the border than you do with the person in the centre of your own nation. We know that the area shared culture going back into prehistory, with the material culture discovered by archaeologists on both sides of the border being very similar. The language is also very similar, with Scots English and Northumbrian English believed to have evolved from the same root of Old English, probably spoken by the Northumbrians, though this is debated by some. What really created the correct circumstances for the Border Reivers to exist were the conflicts started by Edward I and his Scottish rivals, Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. In the future, I will do episodes on each of these men, but for now we can summarise that this didn't help the region at all. The Anglo-Scottish Wars caused for the borders between England and Scotland to become a war zone for over 300 years, with people who were connected by culture and blood separated by a line drawn on the map for political reasons, as well as the political ambitions of kings and dynasties within the region. These ambitions caused years of violent intermittent warfare where the people who were living between were caught in the middle. Imagine, if you're living on the borders, that you have family in both to the north and to the south, with your cousins who live in what is now called Northumberland and the other cousins who live across in now what is the Scottish borders. The King of England's army marches through and asks if you're English or Scottish, but you don't really know because those identities don't really matter where you live. It doesn't really matter though, because they burn down your house, take your crops and your animals all the same. A couple of weeks later, the King of Scots marches through, and in the same way wishes to know if you're English or Scottish. But just like before, it doesn't matter. They take your crops and your animals all the same. This really destabilises the lifestyle of the people living in and around the English-Scottish borders. This destabilisation led to the people who lived on the borders to slowly and steadily reduce farming crops and instead focusing on livestock, even though this was not a safe bet for survival. A few people can easily move livestock and therefore it would just be as much prey to armies moving through the border. This though did inspire the Border Reivers in other ways, as they decided to use this wisdom to the best of their advantage. They began raiding other families and the more stabilised land to the north and to the south, so that they could provide food for their families, and they became very, very good at it. This turned the English-Scottish borders into an area of low-level violence that got worse and worse over the period. Roughly 50 miles on either side of the border was an area where no one's house, livestock or life was safe from attack. This meant that though warfare was a constant fear for many in medieval life, With many countries' kings, lords and barons fighting amongst each other, the Reivers on the border were a fear for everyone, no matter their status or rank. The loyalties of kingdoms and the feudal system were replaced by a tribal system of families interconnected by marriage. In the area of Tynedale and Redesdale, things got so bad that people were starving to death during the Anglo-Scottish wars, and this was mirrored in the Scottish borders. In Northumberland, it was recorded, scarce a soul chose to live in Northumberland, lest it was near to some castle or fortified town. Forced retaliation became a habit amongst the Border Reivers, with one family or another deciding to take revenge for slights or raiding, that it became a part of their identity, where almost every single one of them was trained for conflict and violence at any time. Earlier, I mentioned that people believed that this was connected to the Anglo-Saxon period or Celtic culture. I don't believe this is the case. While raiding was a part of those cultures, it appears to be a part of the traditions of the nobility rather than a necessity to stay alive, which is what it became amongst the Reivers. The constant retaliation led to a different lifestyle within the borders, one that resulted in impoverishment, but then forced people towards violence and raiding to survive, because if they didn't, it was kill or be killed, take or don't eat. That was the reality of the Border Reivers. The Reivers themselves lived in almost temporary structures, caused by the danger of having a house burnt down or attacked by another tribe or group. But it also meant they could be very mobile and quickly abandon and rebuild in another location. These were made from low stone walls, timber posts, and a timber or thatch roof. They would be in some ways very similar to Anglo-Saxon sunken featured buildings. The Reivers called these structures cat and clay buildings. They were in some ways similar to the black houses found in Scotland. The door was often made of cowhide, and it would take about 3 to 4 hours to build this type of house, enabling for the Reivers to set up quickly and destroy them with ease if needed. This kind of structure continued into the 18th century and was a big part of their culture. Their lords, much like the Scottish clan lords, were referred to as lairds and lived in better conditions. These were called peels. Initially, a peel was a palisade of clay and timber, making it very hard to burn, and with the ability to keep livestock and people safe within. But with the instability continuing to get worse and worse, they were then upgraded to become stone towers. These had 2 levels, the ground floor for livestock, and the second was for people. They would place a large ladder at a 45-degree angle within the tower so that the young and old could climb up to the second floor, and then it could be removed so that attackers could not get up into the second level. Short of cannon fire, nothing would get into the peels. In Scotland, the wooden enclosure would be replaced with stone and would become known as a barmkin, and the notable men of communities would ask permission to the Privy Council of Scotland to actually build them. By 1541, there were records in Tynedale of towers being constructed of oak timbers bound together in squares and then covered with levels of turf, again to prevent them from being burnt. They were mirrored in Scotland, and they were known for being nigh impossible to burn and very hard to cast down. Interestingly enough, also very difficult to identify archaeologically. Early forms of these towers had been built of stone with 5 levels, but were eventually standardised at 3, with arrow slits, only 1 window and steeply pitched roofs, and defences such as bartizans, a platform built out of the tower to enable for things to be dropped down on the attackers. Inside each of these towers would be a clan bell to call for support in case of attack. As you can see, even for the lairds, life was hard and focused towards violence and conflict and danger. The main wealth of the Border Reivers were in cattle and sheep, since these could be protected on the upland areas of Northumberland, Cumbria, Dumfriesshire and the Scottish borders by armed members of the clan. This also led the innovative Border Reivers to look hungrily upon their neighbour's property. If you were in a difficult situation, the answer was simply steal someone else's sheep and cattle. After all, there's not much difference between an English or a Scottish sheep or cow, and it's a fantastic way to combine business and pleasure at the same time. Both countries attempted to come up with a method of controlling the Anglo-Scottish border and appointed wardens of the border marches, with the English and Scottish borders divided between 3 main areas: the east, the middle and the western marches. Powerful families such as the Percys, Nevilles, Maxwells, Holmes, Douglases were all given this role and were required to attempt to bring peace and stability to this volatile region, while at the same time watching against raids from their opposition on the other side. This resulted in an interesting political situation, resulting in a complex strategy of intimidation, violence, bribery, and simply ignoring the problem and hoping it will go away, while claiming the salary given with the role and requesting more funding from the central government to deal with the issues that you were faced with. They were given the power to summon together both sides of the border with truce days, which is where both sides were meant to bring their most wanted to be handed over to the opposing side, and alongside this return lost or stolen goods, those which hadn't been eaten following their theft. At these meetings, warrants, called bills, were presented. Criminals needed to be declared clear, which meant innocent, or foul, which would mean guilty, or fouled by non-attendance, which meant that they had chosen not to turn up. This was incredibly difficult to do, as the jurors were generally the friends and family of the accused. The wars of Scottish independence continued to add fuel to the fire, with the English and French factions who desired to place favourable monarchs on the throne of Scots, complicating matters of the border even further, exacerbating the issues and adding fresh finances to the conflict. On the other hand, the Borderers entered into their wars of independence with joy. While things had been bad and difficult for them with a lack of food, sustenance, and a lack of stability, the wars of independence meant their skills were needed and were backed up by powerful financial backers in the forms of the Kings of England, the Kings of Scots, and the King of France. It must have been deeply frustrating for the Border Reivers whenever peace was declared, as life would become slightly more boring and the new exotic enemies that the conflict had brought would go home, making your main focus of violence be your neighbours again. So this concludes the first episode on the Border Reivers, and I really hope you'll join me again as we go more into the world of the Reivers and what happened to them. If you haven't already done so and you would like to, please do like and subscribe, share the video with your friends. I do also have a Patreon and a Ko-fi account down in the description. Thank you as always for watching, and I look forward to sharing more history with you in the next episode.